Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast in our series on names. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Steve Walton to talk about names in the New Testament, specifically in the book of Acts. Hi, Steve. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You're a very regular visitor to Tyndale House. Why do you keep coming here and what are you doing here?
I first came here in 1977.
That's quite a long time
when
ago.
I was an undergraduate. But I keep coming because I'm working on a big long-term project on the book of Acts.
Right.
So I'm writing a major commentary for the word biblical commentary. And that's why I keep coming, because you have lots of books here, and they're the books I need to read. And especially you've got everything, particularly in French and German,
right.
Which are not generally easily accessible.
Okay, right. So where are you the rest of the time? Where are you based? What do you do?
Home is Loughborough. My wife and I belong to Emmanuel Church in Loughborough, where she's associate rector. And I work 2 days a week for Trinity College, Bristol, as a supervisor of doctoral students. I've got about 9 at the moment who I'm working with. And I'm not physically in Bristol very often, yeah. But I don't need to be because my doctoral students are dotted all over the world.
Sure. And
we can talk on the internet.
Yeah, great. How long have you been working on Acts?
Well, I started thinking about Acts in 1977. My first term at Cambridge, Charlie Moll set me an essay on the major theological themes of Luke. And that got me into considering how Luke and Acts go together. And specifically, it got me into a debate about how far the portrait of Paul in Acts is like the portrait of Paul in the letters. Mm-hmm. And that was what ultimately led to my PhD project in the 80s and 90s. And then I got asked to write a commentary. So I guess the answer is a long time.
Right. But you've not been working on Acts the whole of that time?
No. I've written a textbook on the Gospels and Acts with David Wenham. Right. I dip my toe in the water of Paul occasionally. If you work in Acts, you end up in the Gospels via Luke,
sure.
And you end up in Paul inevitably.
Yeah.
So I range across the New Testament because of the focus on Acts.
And where are you in that project for writing the Word Biblical Commentary?
You'll be seeing the first volume on Acts 1 to 9 in October.
Great.
And I'm in the middle of chapter 16 at the moment, so I'm in Philippi.
Very good.
And dealing with the events that go on in Philippi with Lydia, the girl who's possessed by a demon, and then Paul and Silas being thrown into prison. So that's where I am at this very moment.
Great. Is it going to be 2 volumes or
3? I'm afraid 3. Right. We were planning 2.
Okay.
But it then became too long.
Yeah, when you said volume 1 was 1 to 9, I was wondering. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Where will the next break come?
After 19.
Okay, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. What have been the highlights of working on that for you?
I think it's been a growing understanding of how Acts is a narrative driven by God and God's action. And seeing that in place after place after place in the book of Acts. Now, I'm far from the first to notice this. My friend Beverly Gaventa's little commentary on Acts sees this brilliantly. She and I had noticed it independently and then met at a conference and said, "Oh, I thought I was the only one," which was kind of nice. But that discovery, I think, has been really significant because some people think Acts is a book about the Holy Spirit, but there's actually almost no mention of the Spirit in the last 25% of Acts, from 21 to 28. It's really, really striking.
Right. That's interesting. I've heard it said so many times, and I've said myself many times, that we should talk about it as the acts of the Holy Spirit, not the acts of the apostles. But actually, so you're saying, well, I think God's a bit bigger than that.
Yeah, I'd say it's the acts of God.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. We want to talk about names particularly, as we are doing in this series of podcast episodes. There's a lot of people mentioned in Acts from all sorts of backgrounds. So there's a whole range of names that we encounter. What are some of the different backgrounds, language groups, kinds of names that we encounter in Acts?
Let me give you two examples. One is Tabitha in Acts 9, who dies, and Peter then goes and prays, and she's raised from the dead. She's also called Dorcas.
Right.
Tabitha is a good Hebrew name. Dorcas is a Greek name. The two words both mean gazelle.
Right.
Now that suggests that she's somebody who's known in both the Hebrew-speaking, Aramaic-speaking, and Greek-speaking communities. So she's known by those two names.
Right.
So she's somebody who crosses boundaries, which makes sense because Western Palestine on the coast was a multicultural area,
right.
and there are a good number of Romans around there who would have used the Greek name for her. A second one is Simon Peter,
right.
who in Aramaic is called Cephas.
Yeah.
And he's called that in Acts 15 when you have the major meeting at Jerusalem to decide about the admission of Gentiles.
Right. Yeah.
And that means rock.
Yeah.
Jesus has called him Petros,
right.
In Greek, which comes from the word Petra, which means rock. So he's got this nickname. But of course, in the gospel, he proves to be far from a rock. But in Acts, he's learned the lesson, and he becomes the rock that Jesus has said he'll be.
Yes, right. Yeah, yeah. So is Acts 15 the only place he's called Cephas?
He's called that in Galatians as well.
Okay.
Right. So he's called Cephas in Galatians 2.
Yeah. Okay.
When Paul visits Jerusalem.
Yeah, and they have a bit of a. Is that when Paul and Peter are having a contretemps in Galatians?
No, well, the first bit of Galatians 2, 1-10, there's the agreement that the Jewish believers based in Jerusalem will focus on Jewish mission, and Paul and Silas will focus on Gentile mission.
Yeah.
But then they have the bust up in Antioch in 2:11 onwards, because Peter gives way to the group who want to separate from Gentile believers and to eat separately because they want to keep Jewish kosher over their food.
Right. And so those are the only places where is Aramaic?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And they're both places where there's a major Jewish issue at stake. Do we need to circumcise men who become believers? Do we need to keep Jewish food laws? Yeah.
So do you think it would not have worked for Luke in Acts 15 and Paul in Galatians to have used the Greek Petros rather than Cephas?
I think
would people not have got the point? Or?
Well, the meaning would have still been clear, but it does rather suggest that the conversations that were going on tended to focus on his Jewish identity.
Okay, right.
Because that was where the debate was.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. One of the major characters in Acts, of course, most people who've read Acts will have noticed that Paul comes up quite a few times. But when we meet him, he's Saul.
Yes.
And some people make a very big deal over the fact that from Acts 13 onwards, once he's been to Cyprus and encountered the proconsul Sergius Paulus, that from that point on, he's referred to as Paul, and therefore Saul has changed his name, and it signifies something deep and meaningful, which I've never been entirely convinced by, but I had no good reasons for that. And then I came across something that you'd written.
Yes.
That gave some quite solid reasons why that's not a good
Well,
so tell us about this.
Yeah, well, let's start with Roman names because that's a key to this. Names are really significant in the ancient world, and we've seen examples of people with double names, and there are quite a number around. Yeah. We've got evidence from at least the 2nd century BC of people with these double names, and we still use them today. Edison Arantes do Nascimento is better known as Pele.
Okay. Yep. Right.
So we still do that too.
So, are you talking about somebody who has a given name and a nickname, or
well, more than that, because a typical Roman would have 3 names.
Right.
They'd have a praenomen, and they were often taken from a very limited list. There were only 18 in the late Roman Republic, so they were often abbreviated to just a letter. M means Marcus, G means Gaius.
Right.
Then you get the cognomen, which was the name by which people were known.
Yeah.
Slaves who became citizens would often adopt that name from their master.
I see. Right.
So as a slave, they'd have just had one name.
Right.
But when they became a citizen, they'd acquire the other 2 names, which they generally took from their liberator. Yeah. And then you got a 3rd name, which is the family name. Right. That you receive at birth. So in my case, that will be Walton. Yeah. That's my family name.
Right.
Now that set of 3 names is interesting. We only know Paul's cognomen, Paulos.
Right. Right.
We don't know the other 2, and we wish we did.
Okay.
But
so can I just go back to the 3-part names? So there's I've mentioned Sergius Paulus already.
Yeah.
So it seems he comes from the Antioch of Pisidia area, where there's an inscription to an L Sergius Paulus. Yes. So the L is this Lucius abbreviated, one of these limited number of first names, and then he's got Sergius, and Paulus is the family name.
So Sergius is the family name.
Oh, Sergius is right.
Paulus is the name by which he's known.
Yeah.
So his mum would call him Paulus.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Now, what happened with Jewish people was they often had a 4th name, which is called the signum or the supernomen, and that 4th name would be the name by which they were known within the family.
Right.
Now, it's
so like, this is somebody who's a Jewish person who's a Roman citizen, like Paul.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's likely, therefore, that his family name was Saul. Interestingly, there are 2 spellings of it in the New Testament. There's Saul, which is the letter-by-letter transcription from the Hebrew name of King Saul in the Old Testament. Yeah. And there's Saulos, which is the Greek form of the name. Right. He's only called Saul by Jesus in the appearance on the Damascus Road. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
Right.
So that suggests Jesus speaks to him in Aramaic or Hebrew.
Right.
Whereas the rest of the time he's known as Saulos. However, Saulos isn't a great name sometimes, because the Greek word for Saulos means effeminate. Or conceited.
Right. Yeah.
And so if you were hanging around with Greek speakers, you might not want to be known as Saulos because of the connotations that went with the name. So that might explain, there's a scholar called Leary who wrote an article arguing that might be a factor in the shift to Paulos, to using his Roman name, but obviously put over into Greek.
Right. So are you suggesting then that Saulus is his, or Saul is his Jewish name, but his family also had this family name of Paulos?
Yes.
It's not, and the similarity of sound is coincidental? Not coincidental, but
I mean, maybe his family chose the name Paulos for that reason. But the other thing is that Paulos means small, or as we might say today, shorty.
Okay, right.
And maybe he was a very small baby.
Right.
When he was born.
Yeah.
And therefore they said, okay, we'll call him small Paulos.
Right.
Which would make a lot of sense.
Yep.
It's Saul is widely used among Jews. We've got a number of uses among diaspora Jews in this period of that name in inscriptions. And Paulos also seems to be pretty common among the Latin Greek-speaking world. Right. In Latin, it would be Paulus.
Okay.
But it seems to be pretty common in that world. So it's an example of we've got few examples of Jewish people with the name Paulus.
Right. But
it is quite common among ordinary Roman Greek people.
Yeah, right. So having come from a family in Tarsus, in Cilicia, is that remember? Yeah. So he's not grown up in Jerusalem. So he's growing up as a Roman citizen, in a family of Roman citizens, would it be, but Jewish in that community?
He says that he inherited his citizenship from his father.
Yes, because he didn't have to buy it.
Yeah. When he's talking with the tribune in Jerusalem. He's inherited it, and possibly his father got the citizenship because of services to the empire.
Right.
We've got a good number of examples of that happening to people.
Okay.
But the truth is, we don't really know. We don't really know.
Okay. Right. So it would make sense that Paul has this Roman name structure of the three names plus his Jewish name. It's a shame we don't know the other two names, isn't it? That would just fill things out a little.
It is, yes. Yeah, Luke just gives us the details we need to have.
Yes, fair enough.
Not the ones we wish we had.
He's not the only biblical writer to fall into that trap.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. So when we get to Acts chapter 13, it's a shift in... There is a shift that's taking place, but it's more a shift of what's useful for Paul rather than taking on a new name and a new identity.
Yeah, and Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, suggested that the change was because he adopted Sergius Paulus's name. Yes. And I greatly doubt that.
Okay.
I think it's much, much more likely he already had the name Paulos.
But you see that coming up a lot in the commentaries.
Oh, yes. And there are a number of people who suggest that. But the probability is that he had both names from childhood.
Right.
Now, more plausibly, it's to do with the role he's playing in the narrative and the context in which he is.
Okay.
William Ramsey suggests that when you see Paul in Jewish context, he introduces himself as a Jew from Tarsus, like in the midst of the riot in Acts 22, when he speaks. But elsewhere, in the court of a Roman governor in Cyprus, it would be much more natural to use his Roman name, Paulos.
Yep.
And so once Paul starts to engage with Gentile mission seriously, which he does from Cyprus onwards, then the Greek name just makes a lot more sense than being known by a Jewish name, even though he's clearly proclaiming a message rooted in Judaism.
Yes.
Now, that's, and I think there's some truth in that. Kingsley Barrett, in his big commentary on Acts, looks the opposite direction to Ramsey, which is backwards from Cyprus. Right. And he notices that in Saul, without exception, that the use of that name occurs in the Jewish context earlier in Acts.
Right.
So it's in Jerusalem, it's in Damascus among the Jews there. So it crops up when that's going on.
Right.
Barnabas fetches Saul from Tarsus from Cilicia to go to be with him in Antioch to work with this first ever Jew plus Gentile believing community.
Right.
So he's Saul, Barrett says. And that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
And there's the Jewish flavour of that part of Acts is really quite significant. So putting the two together, you've got on the one side Jewish context known by Jewish name, and it's therefore interesting that in the Jerusalem meeting in Acts 15, he's called Saul again.
Yeah. Right.
He just pops up as Saul.
Yeah.
And you find yourself thinking, oh, he's been Paul ever since Cyprus.
Yeah.
But now, and instead of his name coming first, it's Barnabas and Saul in chapter 15. So
back to how it is when Barnabas fetches him from Tarsus.
And we've had Barnabas and Saul until Cyprus.
Yes.
And then once we get onto the mainland and they go to Pisidian Antioch, it's Paul and Barnabas.
Right.
So he has switched to his Roman Greek name, and he's become the senior of the two, because the one you name first is the senior person. So that's really interesting, because back in Jerusalem, they still think Barnabas is the senior, and they call Saul by the name Saul,
because they don't see Barnabas and Saul between. The community in that part of the world don't see them from the time they set off from Antioch until they've been through Cyprus, Pisidian Antioch, all of that area on the first missionary journey, and then come back.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a really interesting set of switches. And the only bit of contribution Barnabas and Saul make is to testify to what God's done through them in the journey they've had in what we call Acts 13 and 14 through the south of modern Turkey, through southern Galatia. Right. So it's in that area that it's been Paul and Barnabas. But now we're back in Jerusalem, it's Barnabas and Saul. So, but that's the last time he's called Saul in the book of Acts, apart from the two reports in Acts 22 and Acts 26 of the Damascus Road story, when he again says, Jesus said to me, Saul, Saul.
Yes. Because then he's reporting his story. Yes. He's not identifying himself at that point. Yeah. This may be an impossible question to answer. Does Paul become the leader early on, as soon as they hit the mainland, or as soon as they get to Pisidian Antioch, at any rate, having come from Cyprus, and now it's Paul and Barnabas? Is Paul the leader to start with because Paul is already he's obviously growing into it, but has he now come into the status of being the apostle to the Gentiles, or is he the leader simply because he's the local boy? He's from, relatively speaking, and Barnabas isn't.
Well, Cilicia's way over in the east of modern Turkey.
Sure, but it's a lot closer than Barnabas' home, isn't it?
Well, yes. But Barnabas comes from Cyprus.
Oh, of course he does, yeah, okay. That's true.
They're an interesting pair, because I think we owe Paul to Barnabas. There are two incidents where that happens. One is in Acts 9, when he gets to Jerusalem for the first time, and the apostles are, with good reason, highly suspicious of him, because the last time they met him, he was throwing believers into jail. And it's Barnabas who speaks for him and commends him, and they receive him. And then 10 years later, it's Barnabas who fetches him to Syrian Antioch and gives him the opportunity. So my guess is that Barnabas has recognised the gifts that Saul/Paul has and knows that he can help the church in Antioch. And it's interesting, because when they get to Lystra in Acts 14, which is this pagan city, and they call Paul and Barnabas by names of their gods. Yes. They call Paul Hermes, Mercury, because he's the speaker. Right. And they call Barnabas Zeus, which is actually a much more senior god. So Paul's speaking ability is the thing that gets recognised. And I think it's because of the effectiveness of his speaking and the effectiveness of his evangelism that he becomes the senior.
Right.
He's the kind of senior church planter, you might say in our terms.
Yes. Is it possible that Barnabas is a little older than Paul, and therefore they give him, because presumably they could have chosen another Greek god to name to identify with Barnabas, but they call him Zeus. Could that be because he's older than Paul? Paul's the messenger, Paul's the spokesperson, but Barnabas is an older man.
That's certainly possible.
But we have no way of knowing.
The trouble is, it's difficult to know. I mean, Barnabas is a Levite, and you don't start functioning as a Levite till you're 30. He's got land in Cyprus that he sells in Acts 4. So it looks as though he's somebody who has inherited and he has the power to sell. So that probably puts him as a bit older, whereas Saul, we know from Galatians 1, is somebody who has become a kind of young Turk. Turk is probably not the right word to use.
Probably isn't, but it's...
but he's the kind of young, sparky individual. So probably in his 20s, which is pretty young to become a significant leader in Judaism. Now, people live far shorter than we live in those days. So it's not like somebody who gets a PhD in their 20s and then changes the world. But he's the kind of person who is clearly very, very significant and very, very surprisingly so. He says he excelled over all his contemporaries in Galatians 1, which is really striking about him. So yes, I think it's possible that Barnabas is the older man, but impossible to know for sure.
And anything else to say about Paul's name, Paul Saul?
I think we've covered most of the things. The shift of names is something that we do know happens in Scripture. So think of Abram, who becomes Abraham, exalted father to father of many, and that happens with others. Jacob, heel grasper, becomes the one who fights with God, Israel. And you can see the L, which is the name of God, in that. So that sort of double naming is interesting. But it doesn't look as though Saul is given the name Paul. I think it's highly likely he'd had it from birth. Like Tabitha or Simeon Niger in Acts 13:1. Niger means black. So Simeon is almost certainly an African of some kind. And racism of the kind we know today didn't exist in the ancient world, based on skin colour. Black people were considered exotic, but not looked down on because of their skin colour, which is really interesting. So one of the authors speaks of blameless Ethiopians, for instance. So they can be thought of quite highly. So those kind of double names are around. But in Paul's case, I think that the change of name is about facilitating his evangelism. And that sounds to me like 1 Corinthians 9. To the Jews I became as a Jew, to the Gentiles I became as a Gentile. That I think that's the driver. Because for Paul, the thing that matters most to him, more than anything else, is that people hear and respond to the gospel and come to know God through Christ. That's the driver of his life. And that's the focus of what he wants to do.
Excellent. I think that's a great point to leave it. Steve, thank you so much. That's been fascinating.
That's okay. Thank you.